All right. It's time for then we're talking about the restoration movement. Uh got some things then you know, you got to see a progression. Uh I can appreciate why this is 2 semesters long, but you've got to really see why and how these things came to be. Here is the Reformation movement and how it came. Then you got the Restoration movement. These men are beginning to go back to the Bible. We've seen that with James O'Kelly, Abner Jones. These men then really started before that. And now we're coming then to these men that are beginning to see the fault, the frailty with human creeds, and they're beginning to give them up, and they're beginning to see that now, understand where they're coming from and where they're going to. And then we are building and have built then on their shoulders, such as they have built then on people that have gone before them. Now, when we look tonight at the Campbells, we're looking at Thomas Campbell. We're going to look at Alexander Campbell. There's still some dates that need to be understood about these things, and it is an ongoing process. Okay, as for these men, we still need to go back to the Bible, let the Bible be our source of authority in matters of religion. They're going to talk about that then this evening. We still need to do that today, and have that then as our guide in our religion. Okay. And so we're going to talk about the Campbells. Like I said, we're going to begin by really in the middle to me. This is talking about a young man by the name of John Rowe in 1950. He was 23 years old, and he was coming to Bethany, Virginia, where's Bethany College. Alexander Campbell was the president of Bethany College. He had never met him before. Now, let's see where he's from. Let's see. He is then from Ohio. He had a letter. This Rowe, young man by the name of Rowe, had a letter from his preacher, J.H. Jones, who preached at Wooster, Ohio, and had a letter addressed to President Campbell, as they call him here, because he was president of the college. And he got to see Campbell, never met him before, but he had known of him and who he was, and knew then some things, kind of a hero worship when you really look at it. And he then wanted to meet him. And Campbell, if you know anything about Campbell, you know anything about a study, and if you don't, you need to. I'm not sure if it's at Bethany College or where it is, but there are pictures then of his study. It's octagon shaped, I think, or something like that. I don't think it has any windows like we would think of windows. It has maybe some higher up to let light in. But it had only one chair in it, and it was all then had books all the way around it. And so when he got there, he found Campbell in his study then, and Campbell then immediately took some books and pointed to them and said to Rowe, please, sir, take a literary seat. And literally a literary seat. And he said from then that broke the tension that Rowe was feeling. And so they then were, he was set at ease then from then on in. His reputation, Campbell's reputation was nationwide. It's interesting when you look at how many people then came to him, famous people came to him and knew of him. And let's see. Campbell was no usual man. His appearance then was tall, vigorous, and athletic. His hair was light, and his complexion was moderately fair. Redhead, maybe something like that. As I picture him and see him then, because of where he's from too. Ireland. His face had no straight lines. His nose arched, as John Smith then said, was a little to the north. Few ever saw him when his countenance was not cheerful. Men came from miles to drink at his fountain of knowledge. The saints of the age have beaten the path to his door. When you see what he studied and what he did, you'll understand that. Scarcely can a man be found who does not have some trait more pronounced in his makeup than others. Campbell then was the rare combination of many of the nobler traits. His outstanding quality seemed to be that of concentration, which gave him then a rich storehouse of knowledge. And he was widely read, but this gave him then he could recall that information. His mind was keen, it was logical, his arguments were generally well arranged. Friends and foes spoke in praise of this man. Worldly great recognized in Campbell is no common man. Robert E. Lee spoke of Campbell, knew Campbell, had made it his acquaintance. There was a man, and this is what he said about him. This was a man in whom were illustriously combined all the qualities that could adorn or elevate the nature to which he belonged. Knowledge, the most virtuous and extended virtue that ever loitered in her career nor deviated from her course. A man who, if he had been delegated as a representative of a species to one of superior worlds, would have suggested a grand idea of the human race. Such was President Campbell. N.L. Rice, who debated Campbell in the Campbell-Rice debate. You can still get a copy of that. 1843, was in the height of his power. He was, well, I'll get into that too about his age. I'm not really sure about how old he was. Let's see. He was then at the height of his power. Talbot Fanning, okay. Well, one of Campbell's great admirers writes of Campbell then about this time that he was about 60 years old. And like I said, it's going to be, there's a question about that. We'll get into that maybe tonight. I don't know. He's been blessed by nature with a fine constitution, has led a most active life, and consequently enjoyed remarkable good health for one his age. And his intellect is as vigorous as it was at 25. In personal appearance, there is no man like him. His scholarship is admired by both friends and foes. His logical powers, the world, in my humble opinion, has not his equal. As a disclaimer, he is not generally admired by the multitude, but men of the best order, best order of mind, are always delighted with his addresses. He is most chaste, pointed, dignified in all of his public exhibitions, knows not how to take advantage of an opponent, nor will he condescend to little tricks for the sake of applause. Now, you got to understand debates back then, they would use things like that. If they weren't going well, they would, do some tricks, and they would do some things there to belittle the opponent. And you have to read and know debates, and that's what you should be doing, is reading debates. That's what I was, debates are important. Let's see. His arguments are always well arranged and generally full and satisfactory on every point he touches. It is scarcely probable that any man has ever become truly distinguished who has not attained his preeminence for someone of particular trait. And evidently, Alexander Campbell owes his greatness to his powers of concentration. This is what his peers are saying about him then. His habit in presenting a greatest subject in a few pointed and palatable propositions. His doctrine is that the universe is ruled by a few general laws, and to illustrate the most important truths, a few leading points only need be discussed. For logic, scriptural knowledge, genuine criticism, dignity of manner, fairness, and the Christian courtesy, it is barely probable that Alexander Campbell has an equal living person. Okay. These strong words might be well asked that Fanning overstated it. Friends of Alexander do not think so. There's never been a question then to them that Campbell was one of the foremost thinkers in the nation, and that his religious influence has been on the whole a precious enlightenment to those inquirers after the truth of God's word. Let's see. He had a lasting influence on people. Such stories take us back 2 centuries and off to a country where it's beginning far away from America. So here's where it's beginning. The story begins in Northern Ireland in 1786. It is then a people of distinct and different from the usual Irish, such as the Hindus are from the Christians. So, no comparison there. Here is the north and eastern corner of the Emerald Island where Alexander Campbell was born. And the people are predominantly Anglo-Scottish in blood and Protestant in religion. We'll talk more about his religion in a little bit. It was settled in Ireland. This area was settled in the 17th century by Presbyterian Scots. This section of Ireland has long struggled with Catholic Ireland, okay? To the south of them, and in their own independent way, they have declared their liberty even down to the present day. Talks about the geography then, the fertile lands then that made them and gave them the independence because of then they could grow crops and they were prosperous in those areas. Crops, I think, sheep, those type of things that they grew could make them prosperous, and they became then influential people. Liberty, they had their own, they weren't depending upon other people. They were doing well for themselves, made their own living there. The exact date of Alexander Campbell's birth will probably never be settled to satisfaction, okay? Records of the date were lost in a shipwreck when Alexander Campbell was coming to America. He came one time and started on the journey, but there was a shipwreck. And then, and we're kind of glad for the shipwreck because he went to Glasgow University and got some education there, and that influenced then on him from there. So the records were lost in a shipwreck. There is then differences of opinion. Let's see what this Richardson dates the place at September 12th, 1788. W.K. Pendleton, then twice the son-in-law of Campbell, places the date in June of 1786. Moses E. Lord, another restorationist, placed the date at 1787. Talbot Fanning thought Campbell to be older than any of these men put it. In March or April of 1835, Campbell and Fanning were on an extended tour of the United States, and they stopped in Georgetown, Kentucky to visit the home of John T. Johnson. And they were dining together. there was a man by the name of Richard N. Johnson, and Campbell and R.N. Johnson, in the course of their conversation, discussed their age. And there was, says Fanning, no doubt in the minds of either of them that they were the same age. And Johnson was 54 years old at that time, in which case the birth of Campbell is put back to 1781. Charles V. Seeger, who wrote the biographical sketches of Campbell in the book Lectures on the Pentateuch, uses the date of Campbell's birth as the same as Pendleton, his son-in-law twice, as 1786 then. Seeger declares that this was the date that Thomas Campbell, okay, Thomas is Alexander's father, Thomas Campbell gave to him in 1847, and with the one which the family generally considered most correct. Most, I think, what most people think then, and go with Seeger's date, Alexander was born then in 1786, in June of 1786. Okay. So when we look then closer, let's see, his father then was in 1786. There lived a preacher in the Cedar Church by the name of Thomas Campbell with a bride of less than a year, Jane Campbell. And here was their first son, Alexander, was born. Thomas, James, Archibald, and Enos were the four sons of Archibald Campbell, and Thomas being the elder. Now, Archibald is Thomas's daddy, is just stated here. So it would be Alexander Campbell's then grandfather. Thomas Campbell then was born February 1st, 1763 in County Down, Ireland. So Alexander Campbell was born also in Ireland too. Thomas had a bright intellect and determined to be a teacher. He then went to Southern Ireland, and I'm sure that didn't sit well with a lot of folks because of the difference in religion. And his father then, Archibald, called him back back home, and he settled down to teach at Sheepbridge in the southern part of County Down. Before many months, Campbell then had customarily experienced, was led to believe he was called of God to preach, and he began then to the anti-burger group of the Cedars, and we'll talk more about all of that, how that got to be them. Through the help of John Kinley, who promised to pay his expenses, Campbell attended Glasgow University for 3 years, finishing. Now, he finished in 3 years the prescribed courses, and then went to Wittenberg, where he studied under Professor A.B. Bruce in the anti-burger school. Finishing his course, he took the examination, was given a license to preach under the synod. His first preaching then was done near Sheepbridge. Now, this is still in Ireland. After his marriage to Jane, he moved then to Market Hill, and then moved to another place in 1798 in a place called Rich Hill. It is near here that the youthful days of Alexander Campbell were spent. Alexander Campbell then, his greatness and was attributed and is attributed to his parents. Thomas Campbell was a severe critic, a kind disciplinarian, and a devoted scholar. Alexander's mind was very early to be filled with large sections of literature. He read extensively. He memorized many choice items in literature and in scripture. It was the rule in the Campbell family that each child should sometime during the day memorize a verse of scripture to recite at evening worship. Almost daily, the boy studied the Bible along with Brown's catechisms. Now, watch this. He memorized rich passages in Greek, Rome, French, and English literature. In later years, many marveled at his knowledge, which Campbell possessed. Fanning then says of him, he never saw a man so perfectly familiar with the most important events recorded in the sacred oracles, particularly the Old Testament, and also in Greek, Roman, and English poetry. Singularly, it may appear that Alexander Campbell could recite and fully appreciate more of the English poets, especially Milton, Shakespeare, Thomas, and Young, than anyone with whom he had the satisfaction of associating. Campbell, in his literary taste, seems to have little desire for the more modern production. Everything from the Reformation movement on back, Reformation on back then, to ancient history, he knew extensively. But the more modern writings, times he had nothing. He didn't care. It didn't challenge him enough. Campbell's religious background is very interesting. Thomas Campbell was highly regarded for his Bible, and this fact then very early made an impression on Alexander's mind. He would come to his father's library and notice frequently the Bible and concordance upon the stand, while many other books were in the library shelves untouched. Gradually, his father was turning more to the Bible as a pure fountain of living water than from the creeds and doctrines of men. So he is planting the seeds then in his son. Thomas is planting that seed then of going back to the Bible. The church to which Campbell belongs was previously stated as the Cedar branch of the Presbyterian Church. Its history is long, complicated, but to understand the Campbells, you have to go back and understand it. So we go back to Scotland in 1558. Now this gets back to the Reformation movement and some things that are going along there. The church state and how the church then was supported by the state and all of this kind of stuff. So we got to do with all this. So in Scotland in 1559, there was a large class of insurgents, Calvinistic in belief, who opposed the regent, the king. Those in Queen Elizabeth hated them, but because of politics, and politics makes strange bedfellows, she found herself on their side. And she won out, and the Treaty of Edinburgh was signed in 1560, providing that the government of Scotland should be turned over to a council of lords. In August that same year, the Scottish Parliament made Calvinistic Protestantism the established religion of Scotland. Presbyterianism, really. But in a few years, Calvinism was not to have an easy time. Much credit can be given to John Knox for withstanding Mary Stuart, regent of Scotland, an ardent Catholic, and thus prevented the nation from going into Catholicism. Before long, Mary became unpopular and was forced to abdicate the throne in 1566. All right, in 1578, the Second Book of Discipline, embodying the full Presbyterian organization, was drawn up. The General Assembly was made supreme. Now, when they're talking about made supreme, they ruled the church and they ruled the civil. It worked through providential synods and the presbyteries down to the local parish. The Book of Devotion, which Knox had composed at Frankfurt for use in the church at Geneva, formed the substance for the Book of Common Order for the Scottish Church. Notwithstanding these events, it was not until 1690 that Presbyterianism in Scotland could sit on a more secure throne. Various attempts were made by the English to plant the Episcopalian religion in Scotland, the Church of England. Okay. In 1638, the Scottish adopted the National Convention of Scots to defend the Presbyterian Church. The English king, Charles I, called shortly after a parliament to handle the Scots. The result was a war which began in 1640, and eventually the Scots had subdued by Cromwell in 1640, but still little peace was found. It was not until the Westminster Confession of Faith was ratified in 1690, and you can get a copy by going to the Presbyterian Church. And usually they have, I don't know, here in Macon, they have a bookstore, and that's where I got mine. I went to the Presbyterians and asked them and bought it from them. So the Westminster Confession of Faith was ratified in 1690, and the Presbyterianism again reigned in Scotland. That peace was to be known. So Scottish Presbyterianism was a fundamental weakness, and it's a close tie-up with the civil government. Okay, we talked about that. After the Presbyterian system had been established by the assembly, the old polity of the church was retained by law. In 1572, a compromise was reached between the ecclesiastical and the civil officers that old names and titles such as bishop and abbots should continue, but the incumbents were subject to the General Assembly, civil, in spiritual things, and to the king in temporal. By the turn of the 18th century, the General Assembly had begun to show its dictatorial spirit, and that's important then. And this was in keeping with the general spirit of secularism, which became characteristics of the time. Secularism in Scotland began to assert itself in 1707 with the union of the English and the Scottish parliaments. Deism began to assert itself in the country, and the Church of Scotland became saturated with the secular spirit of the times. And so these two then parties came to the front, and the moderates and the evangelicals. The former fell into the spirit of the times, and the latter stayed loyal to old orthodoxy. And this makes a difference then. The bulk of the people belonged to the evangelistical group, and the leaders in the church were the more moderates. Okay. Then dissension was, here's dissension. Here's problems are going to rise because of this. And then in 1712, the Union Parliament took away the right of the people to select their own preachers and restored patronage. On the same issue, the General Assembly took action in 1731 with an act declaring that when a vacancy was to be filled by the presbytery, election should lie with the heritors, being the Protestants and the elders. The evangelicals then considered this vital surrender of their rights. And so Ebenezer Erskine and three others, they strongly objected. Erskine then was promptly expelled from the ministry of the church. And the next year, he and others formed the Associate Presbytery and thus the Succession Church was born now. Okay, so here we get the Succession Church. The people were behind the new movement. The assembly announced in 1765 that the Cedars had 120 meeting houses and 100,000 members who formerly belonged to the established Church of Scotland, Presbyterian Church. By 1800, there were 200 Cedar congregations in Scotland. These were the people then that opposed, and that's why they call them Cedars. They're the succession then. Let's see. But by 1800, there were 200 Cedar churches in Scotland, but the good fortune of the Cedars was not to last long. for division was to be characterized of them. In 1789, the Cedars divided into two, burghers and anti-burghers. And on the question of the burgesses taking an oath, I don't know who the burgesses are, but there is the idea of taking an oath. Okay. The burgesses of the town required oaths binding the people to support the religion practice in the realm. Those who considered the oath unlawful were anti-burgesses. In 1799, both branches of the Cedar Church divided into New Lights and Old Lights. And on the question of solemn league and the covenant should be made a term of communion. Okay. So here is then oaths. You have then the first division, then you have oaths, and now you're going to have this division too. So Thomas Campbell then was an Old Light anti-burgher in the Cedar Presbyterian Church. Okay, so you have 1, 2, 3 divisions there. Okay, and thus he was well acquainted with religious division. So Thomas Campbell wanted unity. Okay, and so it was hard on him when he was trying to lead his family closer to God. It was hard on him, and he was led more and more to depend upon the Bible. I made further attempts to follow its leading. Once the Governor General of Ireland offered him a position of private tutor with a large salary in a luxurious home. But Thomas Campbell knew that to move there would displace his family in an environment of worldly pride and fashion. So he refused. As a preacher, he worked hard. Before long, developed a stomach trouble that gave him considerable pain. The doctors could do no good for him, and so they recommended a trip abroad, and that sent him then to America. Several families from where they were already had been in America. Thomas Hodgkins, his daughter had married James Foster, a Scottish independent, and they too had come. Alexander had already told his father that he was coming when he was old enough then to come to America. So Thomas Campbell was faced with the necessity of a trip overseas, so naturally turned to America. For 35 days in 1807, again, that'd be a key date, okay? That would really be one of those test question dates then, 1807. His ship plowed the waters of the Atlantic and finally arrived in Philadelphia. It was early spring, and fortunately, the Senate of North America was in conference in Philadelphia, and here Campbell presented his credentials only to be assigned to work under the Charters Presbyteria in western Pennsylvania. So the next 2 years, Campbell's life can be fairly easily traced through the records and the minutes of the Charters Presbyterian because of the problems, okay? The minutes of Saturday, May the 16th, 1807, tells that Campbell was received for the first time into the fellowship of the group. At the session in June the 30th and July 1st of 1807, Thomas Campbell was given appointments at Buffalo on the second and third Sundays of July, Mount Pleasant on the 4th, and on the first Sunday of August at Pittsburgh. Now, you got to understand, this is Pittsburgh. This is going to be where they live. This is going to be some influence, Thomas Campbell, Alexander Campbell, in these areas then. So these places are going to be coming up more and more then, or not more and more, but they're going to be prominent in the lives of these two men. A man who reads his Bible with an open and intelligent mind then will sooner or later absorb much to make him dissatisfied with human elements in religion. And so that man, his faith encouraged them, would dare him to speak out against what is wrong. As Campbell then fulfilled his appointments, he found himself teaching things contrary to the creeds of the church. But such things then he felt were in harmony with the scriptures. Now, what are you going to go by? You're going to go by your creed, or are you going to go by what the scriptures say? It was only a matter of time until opposition would arise. So the first time of antagonism then came in the regular meeting of the Charters Presbytery, being held at Mount Hope Meeting House on October the 27th, 1807. So May, so here's October. The order of business came around and questioned the fulfilling of appointments, and it found that Mr. John Anderson had not kept his appointment at Buffalo on one recent Sunday, at which time he was to assist Thomas Campbell in administering the Lord's Supper. When Anderson was called upon to give an account of his action, he replied that he knew Campbell to be a teacher of false doctrine, and that he had heard him say before that there was nothing but a human authority for creeds and confessions of faith. The presbytery then asked if anyone else had known of Campbell teaching these doctrines, and Mr. William Wilson responded that he did. So here is this dissent then. Both Anderson and Wilson were typical protectors of orthodoxy. Anderson was a short and stocky man. Well, he was an unpopular preacher. Anderson had become a professor of theology at the associate churches in 1794. Less is known of Wilson. He got his training at Glasgow University and came to America in 1791 or 1792 and was ordained a preacher for the Cedar Church in 1800. So although Thomas Campbell objected to Anderson's charges, it did him little good. The presbytery then promptly penalized him, taking away his appointments for the next 2 months, and I'm sure that also affected his income. Okay. Early in 1808, the presbytery met again, but the matter then only became worse. February 9th, the meeting was at the Buffalo Meeting House. Charges were read again against Campbell, and he asked to speak for himself. And Campbell replied, with regard to faith, I believe that the soul of man is subject to it. The divine spirit is the author of it, the divine word, the rule and reason of it. Christ and him crucified, the object of it. The divine pardon, acceptance and assistance, or grace here and glory hereafter by direct, proper, and formal end of it. So with respect to the confession of faith and the testimonies, I believe that the church has all the divine warrant and for such exhibitions of the truth. After confession and testimony abducted for that purpose, that it was lawful and warrantable to use them as the terms of communion insofar as their testimony requires. In such sense, I have never opposed them. So kind of a wishy-washy type statement here. The Buffalo appears to have lasted down to Saturday, February 11th in 1808, and resulted in suspending Thomas Campbell from the ministry in the Cedar Church. Nevertheless, at their next meeting at Mount Hope, Campbell tried to get them to suspend their judgment, but they refused. He was now ready to appeal to the synod. So local, now he's going up to the next. And the synod of the Associated Church met in May 1808 in Philadelphia, and Thomas Campbell was present. It was on Friday, May the 20th, that they got to his case. The papers were read containing the charges and Campbell's answer. Consideration of the affair was postponed until the next day and continued from then over until the May the 23rd. The results then of that synod upheld Thomas Campbell in many particulars, but concluded by saying his answers on the first two articles were evasive, unsatisfactory, and highly unequivocal. And so Campbell, much against his will, was forced to submit. Okay. So here's June and July of 1808. Campbell preached by appointments in Philadelphia. So when they met again, the Charters Presbyterian met in September. This was September the 13th, 1808. Campbell was there and found no assignments waiting for him, and he asked for the reasons why. There were sharp words of controversy, the charges of falsehood, and Thomas Campbell denounced the authority of the presbytery, the synod, and all their courts. Okay. The next day, he surrendered from his ministerial office. And this day, September 18th, 1808, September 13th, 18, and that's 1808. Okay, we got 1807, 1808 can be taken as the day that Campbell formally made his separation from the Cedarism. Campbell saw evils of division. All right, so he had seen this. The trouble lay with human creeds, and he saw that. So he wanted to be charitable as possible. Alexander then writes of him later, he objected not so much to the doctrines of the Session Creed and platform as a doctrinal basis, but to the assumption of any formal religious theories or opinions as the foundation of the Church of Christ, alleging that the Holy Scriptures, divinely inspired, were all sufficient. Now notice what he's saying here. All sufficient and were alone sufficient for the purpose of contemplated by their author in giving them. So Washington, Pennsylvania, Campbell met then with some friends from Scotland. There were General Thomas Aikson, and he was of the Pennsylvania militia, James Foster and Thomas Hoggins. Each had come from Ireland, and in their houses of these friends, Campbell continued to preach. His voice was heard in Maple Groves, where open services were held. In due time, then, it became evident that they needed a place, okay, to have a meeting house. And so they did. The home of Abraham Altars between Mount Pleasant and Washington, Pennsylvania was chosen. And here was one of the most famous meetings, and the restoration was held. Campbell's speech closed with a famous motto, where the Bible speaks, we speak, and where the Bible is silent, we are silent. So the idea which Campbell embodied here in this motto was not new. Okay, many years before, 1659. So this is 1808. So 1659, a fellow by the name of Fleet, who became Bishop of Worcester, had said, for the church to require more than Christ did himself, or to make the conditions of communion more than our Savior did for discipline, is wholly unwarranted. Then Chillingsworth had written a book, The Religion of Protestants, A Safe Way to Salvation, in 1637. Okay. And the argument that the Bible was the sole authority in matters of salvation. His conclusion that the Bible, I say, the Bible only, and the religion of Protestants purported then to be the claim of all Protestant bodies. Yet, notwithstanding the idea of Campbell presented in the motto was not new, it nevertheless was revolutionary in one phrase. A few people now applied it to Protestant creeds and confessions of faith, whereas the Protestant bodies had almost exclusively applied it to Roman Catholic traditions. For the first time, there were those who realized that the motto struck with equal force against human creeds as it did Catholic traditions. So they're beginning to realize what we're saying now. Okay, quite naturally then, when Campbell first spoke of these words, and paused, there was a solemn hush fell across the assemblies that showed the intensity and the emotion of the hour. Campbell sat down, A Scottish bookseller, Andrew Munro, a rather sentimental person, was the first to break the silence. Mr. Campbell, he said, if we adopt that as the basis, then there is the end of infant baptism. That's pretty. I mean, he went pretty far with his conclusions there, and rightfully so. Campbell replied, "Of course, if infant baptism be not found in the Scripture, we can have nothing to do with it." Thomas Etcherson then arose and cried, "I hope I never see the day when my heart will renounce that blessed saying of the Scripture, 'Suffer the little children to come unto me and forbid them not, for such is the kingdom of heaven.'" Saying that, he burst into tears. James Foster, who even in Ireland had been opposed to infant baptism, rose and cried out. Mr. Etcherson, I would remark that in that portion of the Scriptures you have quoted, there is no reference whatever to infant baptism. And that right there became a source then, and they really realized that there is nothing there in that Scripture about infant baptism. So these men then were not division-minded, okay? There were statements that showed an earnest seeking after the Lord, the way of the Lord. These men were making steps out of intense darkness into light, and the light blinded them for a spell. These men were coming out of the darkness of partyism and stepping forth into the glorious light of the revealed truth, and they staggered for a moment to get their bearings. But from here on, their activities were to be stepped up, and their ideas were taking on more and more definite form. See, they're understanding what they're saying. In a meeting at the headwaters of the Buffalo, held on August 17th, 1809, a small band of men formed themselves into the Christian Association of Washington. Now, this association was not to be organized as a church, but as a society for the promotion of Christian unity. If the idea appears to be related more to denominationalism than apostolic Christianity, it could be explained that on the ground that these men had not yet fully come to a knowledge of the ancient order, but here they were step by step going in that direction. Okay. Richardson then says, neither Thomas Campbell himself, however, nor his associated with him had a full conception of all that was involved in these principles. They only felt that the religious intolerance of the time had itself become intolerable, and that a reformation was imperialistically demanded. So, okay, here we are, making steps. At any rate, as soon as the association was formed, it seemed to immediately that a building in which to meet was needed. So there was a log cabin erected on the Sinclair farm 3 miles from Mount Pleasant, on the road to Washington. From a time this building was used for a school, and Campbell then renewed his teaching career. Near this building was the residence of Mr. Welch, a man friendly to the views of the association. Welch fixed up a room for Thomas Campbell, and here Campbell then spent much of his time. Now he's here in America by himself. Then fixed up this room, and Campbell spent much time studying and writing. Here Campbell wrote the Declaration and Address, which, when it was finished, Campbell called a special meeting of the association and read it before them. The document met their general acquiescence, and then ordered printed on September 7th, 1809. The Declaration and Address is another one of those famous documents that come out of the movement then to restore primitive Christianity. It's divided into 3 parts. One, the Declaration and it gives the purpose and plan of the association. Then the address goes more into detail, giving the forces at work in religious world, which necessitated a restoration movement. So they are calling for that restoration movement. And third part is the appendix, which was designated to answer questions and refute arguments against the purpose of the association. Campbell's plan for unity was, in brief, a restatement in different words of then this famous maxim: essentials unity, and non-essentials liberty, and all things charity. Okay. Campbell used the terms faith and opinion. The former is based on the expressed declaration of the Bible, and the latter then upon things about which the Bible is silent. Unity, Campbell believed, could be realized when the expressed teachings of the Bible in opinions, there could be liberty. The more important and timely enunciations of the Declaration and Address had given it a deserved place among the classics in Restoration literature. Meanwhile, back in Ireland, the family of Thomas Campbell waited patiently for news from Campbell that would call them to follow him to America. In March 1808, the letter came, urging them to hurry to join him. So his family prepared to leave. Misfortune then struck. A smallpox epidemic caused a considerable delay. December 20th, then, before they were in town to get the ship to America, and on September 28th, the ship weighed anchor, and then attempts were put to sea, but the ship had a hard time and didn't get started until October 1st. But hopes were short-lived, for the wind was bad, and the ship then didn't get out to sea. Finally, the ship got into the sea. In the calamities of the world, sometimes the believer can see the hand of God at work. It appears to have been such an act of the providence of that the ship didn't go well. Before long was wrecked. Campbell used the time for meditation, and then and there decided to devote his life to preaching. When youthful Alexander Campbell stepped from the sea onto the rugged coastline of Scotland after the wreck, he was a youth now determined to devote himself to God. On November 8th, then, this would be 1808, Campbell entered Glasgow University, where his father had gone many years before, 25 years. Campbell sat under the Professor Young in Greek, Professor Jardine in logic and Bell's letters, and Professor Urey in experimental philosophy. The latter two taught Thomas Campbell 25 years early. So many students of Campbell's have sought to answer to Campbell's thinking in those intellectual factors which influenced him during the time in Scotland. Just how far this influence can't be determined. He came in contact with Scottish philosophers, and particularly the common sense school of Scottish philosophy. This then philosophy shows up in his thinking in latter years. All right. Thomas Reid, the founder of Common Sense School of Scottish Philosophy, died in 1796. This is 12 years before Campbell came to Glasgow. And then 1763, Thomas Reid, had been the professor of moral philosophy at Glasgow, where for a century following him, his teachings were followed. Intellectual centers such as Aberdeen, Glasgow, and Edinburgh were affected. Protestant thinkers, both in Europe and America, were influenced. Hamilton, Jefferson, Madison, many other leading figures in the colonies were disciples then of Thomas Reid. Reid had been educated at Aberdeen and had followed Adam Smith, author of The Wealth of a Nation. the honor came to him to see, let's see. He rebutted then the skepticism of David Hume. Hume then was once the literary lion of Scotland, but Reed, more than Immanuel Kant, calmed him down by the application of common sense or general reason. And his philosophies then, Reed in his philosophies did believe in God and also believed that man had a soul. His was not skepticism common in philosophy circles of that day. While in Glasgow, Campbell, and this would be Alexander Campbell, came in contact with various independent movements in the church, would doubtlessly influence him profoundly. Here he met Grenville Ewing, formerly minister of Ladies Glenorick in Edinburgh, who had founded the Theology School of Glasgow. Ewing then was connected with the independent movement led by James and Robert Haldane. The Haldane brothers had left the Church of Scotland because of cold formalism in the church. Both relatively wealthy, Robert devoted his money to educating missionaries for work in India. James was the preacher of the two and was more outstanding. He was tireless in his efforts to preach. In 1799, the Haldanes had organized an independent church in Edinburgh. Within years, they had organized 85 churches. It was Ewing then was connected with their theological school that Campbell became acquainted with him, and the two became close as a friend. An independent church had been established at Rich Hill in Ireland. That's where Campbell was from. And James Haldane had preached here while Thomas Campbell was yet there. Another movement led by John Gless and Robert Sanderson also was prevalent in Scotland, and doubtless Campbell learned extensively of these views. John Gless, the minister at Teeling, had been deposed from the Church of Scotland in 1730 and organized an independent church in Dundee, Perth, and Edinburgh. These churches were congregational in government. They denied that creeds and confessions of faith were worth anything. So you see where they're coming from, where Campbell got his ideas too. Gless then taught that there were two classes of officers: the extraordinary, consisting of apostles, prophets, and evangelists, and the ordinary, consisting of the elders and the deacons. Robert Sanderman then adopted independent views in 1755, and Sanderman believed that faith was a simple assent to the testimony of Christ. He advocated the weekly observance of the Lord's Supper. Okay, so these men are influencing Alexander Campbell, and they're studying the scriptures. Here's the proof of this, and so they start doing this thing. So here is the weekly observance of the Lord's Supper, the plurality of elders in one local congregation. The independent movement was led by Gless and Sanderman, differed from those led by the Haldanes by the spirit in which they characterized them. Haldanes were free from controversial spirit, and Sanderman was the opposite temperament. So Alexander Campbell much later writes of Sanderman and Haldanes, considering Sanderman and Haldane, how they can be associated under one species is, to me, a matter of surprise. The former, a PDO Baptist, the latter, a Baptist. The former as keen and as sharp as centrist, and acrimonious as juvenile, and the latter as a mild and charitable and condescending as any man his age has produced. As authors, I know them well. The one is like the mountain storm that roars among the cliffs, the other like the balmy zephyrs that breathe upon the banks of the violets. When Grenville Ewing, Campbell's close friend, and later borrowed an intensely independent spirit, at once he began to examine himself the claims of the Cedar Church as a religious group. Slowly, he was led to doubt them. The critical hour came at the semi-annual communion service near the close of his stay in Glasgow. It was customary to give all who were partakers of the Lord's Supper a metallic token to shut out the non-worthies from partaking. The Lutherans do that. I had a friend of mine who was a former Lutheran said that they did that. As Campbell then had come from Ireland without any letter or recommendation, it was necessary for him to take an examination before the elders on a Saturday to determine his worthiness. He took the examination and passed, but the next day his conscience bothered him. He put his token in the plate that morning and refused to partake of the communion. Campbell had now crossed the Rubicon. He was no longer with the Cedar Church. And July 31st, good date, 1809, Campbell left Glasgow for Greenock, and 4 days later, he and his family were on the ship Lithuania, headed for America. This time the trip went smoothly, and the ship landed in New York on Friday, September 29th. The following Thursday, they left New York for Philadelphia, where they arrived on Saturday. The following Monday, they started on their westward track across Pennsylvania in the direction of Washington. Thomas Campbell then had learned of their coming. He had left his home in Washington, going towards Philadelphia. And on the way, the two parties met. Thomas Campbell fondly embraced his family, and they in turn had their spirits renewed within them by this union. There was much to talk about and much to leave. Much would leave its effect upon the future turn of events. So we're going to notice then more of this next week, these two men and their meetings and what they're going to talk about, and this movement then growing, this restoration. They're beginning to understand that we need to restore the New Testament church as it is written in the Bible. I hope you are enjoying this this study. I know I am. And if you like it, hit like, subscribe, do whatever you need to. Invite others to come and be a part of this. I would appreciate it. I sure do. I'm doing this for, just doing this because I want to. So anyway, appreciate it. And y'all continue on. Thank you very much.